Today is Friday of the 11th week in Ordinary Time. Poor St. Paul. He is clearly in bad shape as we encounter him in today's first reading. He suffered acute anxiety for all the churches, he calls it, for all the far-flung churches that he had helped to establish and nurture. These church communities, his letters tell us, were beset with disagreements about belief and practice, social class divisions, poor leadership, and cults of personality. They were persecuted by synagogue leaders, the Romans, and mainstream Gentile culture. He must have been exhausted by travel, a total of 10,000 miles, scholars estimate, by foot on Roman roads and by sea, uncertain about shelter and food, much less medical care. All this, plus the physical abuse he lists in this reading, must have led him to a desperate sense of wondering if all this suffering was actually leading anywhere. Was he on the edge of a nervous breakdown? Did you notice the interpolated expostulations in the text? I am speaking in foolishness. I am talking like an insane person. Who is weak? Me? Would some Xanax have helped? Or a good therapist? His was naturally an explosive personality, admirable for his zeal, but hard to be around for very long. All his energy he poured into living out an intense dedication to preaching the good news of Jesus. He had little education to help him write his letters, probably little to write with, and no peaceful place to write, and much to be anxious about. He seemed especially irked by the Gentiles around him, who boasted about all their achievements, their success, status, and so on, just like the folks in professional Washington. So perhaps to ridicule them, he boasts about his suffering, which was very real, judging by this reading. But he draws an extraordinary conclusion, quite at odds with our normal way of thinking. Suffering, paradoxically, was an advantage, because it was the entry point for God strengthening him with courage and perseverance, and of God's guiding him to the next round of activity on behalf of these churches. Paul's work, after all, was God's work. He was Jesus' hands and feet and voice and love, just as we are. And God empowered him to do all that he did, as God does with us. Just a few verses later, he says, 3 times I complained to the Lord about my suffering, that it would leave me. But the Lord said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. So, St. Paul concludes, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, that the power of Christ may dwell in me. And there it is, the central paradox of Christianity. God indeed relieves our suffering. Only say the word and my soul shall be healed, we say at the Eucharist. And yet, oftentimes, God does not respond to our suffering and our weakness, precisely because they are the entry points of God's love. Without the suffering, in other words, when everything is going well, we risk forgetting about God, our need for God's assistance, and our rightful need to give God thanks. So we can pray for those who persecute us, as Jesus says, because the persecutions challenge us to remember the source of our true identity, namely God, God's own self, and to live evermore out of that genuine identity. The persecution might also remind us that we're doing the right thing, After all, if no one is angry with us, we may not be doing our jobs. So, name the places of your suffering where you feel weak and vulnerable, and ask the Lord to love you there, to keep you patient and persevering. Are you aggravated by the bishops attacking the president, the politicians who seem to be courting disaster? Are people around you difficult to deal with? Pray for God's strength in those places, and allow His grace to sustain you and fuel your actions. Remember, the alternative is to lose hope and give in to despair. Don't go there. Keep praying for help, and let God's coming strengthen you, and through you strengthen our world.